Okay, welcome everybody. I have a couple of announcements. First of all, the Diversity Fellowship. We are accepting applications for the Summer Diversity Fellowship. As many of you probably know, this is an opportunity for undergraduate and graduate students to work with EdSHARe faculty and staff and get paid for it and have great experiences and so on. And so applications are due March 5th. And now I have some really big news. I'm delighted to announce that Rob Warren has just accepted the office of the Vice President for the Research's offer of position as Director of EdSHARe. So we'll have more details forthcoming as we figure them out.
Yes, this puts a lot of pressure on you because I took over MPC when you started an institute, and I take over the institute when you become a genius, and now you have to do something even more royalty, perhaps.
I'd like to thank Rob for taking on this leadership position. He's the perfect person for the job, and I am sure he is going to lead us into a future of sunshine and discovery.
Sunshine and discovery. All right.
So anyway, today he's going to tell us what he's been up to lately.
That's right. We don't have to say anything more about the Summer Diversity Fellowship Program. Are we especially seeking applicants from potential participants or from people who may serve as mentors? Students. Okay. All right. Excellent. Do apply. Yes, I am here to talk about what I've been up to lately. And what I've been up to lately has now been called EdSHARe. And EdSHARe now has a logo, thanks to Stacy. Thank you, Stacy, for this several logos that we now have. And I'm going to tell you about it. EdSHARe is a product of a PI team that by and large is 5 people here in Texas, Wisconsin, and Columbia. But almost all the work on the project gets done by this collection of folks who are project staff at one of the various sites. I will take the blame for anything that's fundamentally wrong, but anything that's good, they're doing all the work for. But first, a little about me. Sometimes you may know I'm an education researcher. People have claimed that I am an education scholar, and when I have that hat on, when I'm in that world, very often I use education cohort studies. They're sort of the bread and butter of education research, at least quantitative education research, but they're also fundamentally frustrating. And they're fundamentally frustrating because you follow people until they're maybe their mid-20s, and then you know nothing about what happens after that. And you're not wondering, did that amazing educational intervention or program or condition have any impact on people's later lives beyond age 25? Other times, I'm an aging scholar. I'm literally an aging researcher, but I'm also a researcher of aging. And when I have that, it's exactly the reverse situation. At best, you follow people for the second half of their lives, starting often at age 50 with the health and retirement study, which is the elephant in the room of all of these studies. And we know nothing almost about anything that came before that. The HIS, for example, asks a few retrospective questions about your childhood, and they've added a life history component that's only a small percentage of the cohort. And folks around here have linked the HRS to the 1940 census, but really it's a pretty thin portrait of what's going on in people's early lives. So my colleagues and I, that I named on the first slide, had an idea. And that idea, as I recall, they don't recall it this way, but as I recall, there was beer involved. And the idea was, what if we went back to one of these education cohort studies? This is the kind of idea you have after a beer. What if we go back to one of those education cohort studies and follow them forward in time? Go back to one of the cohorts that's at midlife and follow them, treat them as an aging study and follow them forward for some period of time. And so that's what we've done. And so I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about a little bit about the cohorts. And to do that, I've got to go back in time a little bit. There are historians in the room, so I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce a little historical context. Take yourself back to the 1954 Brown decision, 1957, Sputnik. Both of these things had transformative impacts on American education. The 1964 Civil Rights Act similarly had profound implications for American education and society in general. 1965, Johnson signs the Elementary and Secondary School Act. 66, the Equality of Educational Opportunity Report, the Coleman Report, which was a really impactful analysis of the state of American education, especially with respect to racial equity and inequity. This is the historical context that I'm taking you back to. In that context, in the 1960s, folks at the Department of Education, most people credit John Gardner, who was the secretary at the time of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and Dorothy Guilford, who was the director of the commissioner of the statistical arm of the U.S. Department of Education, said we need better data. We need to understand the condition of American education with some granularity and with some regularity. But there really wasn't much of a data infrastructure for doing that. The only exception recently at that time was Project Talent. Project Talent was a massive undertaking that surveyed something like 440,000 American high school students, all in 1960. With psychometrically reasonably well-validated achievement tests and all kinds of lengthy questionnaires about their lives. But what the Department of Education had in mind was a more regular ascertainment of what was going on with American education. And so what they developed at the National Center for Education Statistics, which is within the Department of Education, is what's now called the Secondary Longitudinal Studies Program. Every decade or so, the U.S. Department of Education launches a big new cohort study of American high school students. And what I'm showing you here, a little bit blurry, on the horizontal axis is calendar year, and on the vertical axis is the grade in school that the children would have been at different waves of the follow-up study. And it goes up to 12th grade, and then how many years beyond 12th grade. And so the rankings represent different cohorts. The different colors are different cohort studies. So there's been 5. There's actually been a 6th that would be out here somewhere, and you could add Project Talent to that. Every one of these dots represents intensive interviews with the children or young adults, but also, at least when they're in school, their parents, their teachers, their principals, school administrators, etc. Intensive surveys, pretty high quality achievement tests of things like reading and math and science and civics and so forth. And in fact, they're designed so that the achievement tests are comparable over cohorts. So you can study inter-cohort change in the various factors that might shape academic achievement. Beyond these intensive interviews, these HSTs and PSTs are high school transcript studies and post-secondary transcript studies. They get high school and college transcripts for a huge percentage of these young people, which tells you everything about, I know, for example, what grade people got in freshman English and that kind of thing. And we know what freshman English they took, and we know what math, we know everything really about their educational experiences. So we want to go back to one of these cohorts. And the question was, and follow them forward and make them an aging study. And the question was, which one do we go back to? And I would include Project Talent as a candidate for that. We couldn't start with Project Talent for 3 reasons. One, Project Talent was run by the American Institutes for Research, and they're a little bit insular, frankly, and we're not so keen on us reviving their cohort. They did revive the cohort, coincidentally, after we had some meetings with them. But they faced 2 other problems. One, their people are really old, and many of them are dead, and it's very hard to get good data from deceased people. They're now in their 80s. And the other problem was that the Department of Education did a really crappy job of following up Project Talent in the early years. So in 1960, when they're all in high school, it's easy to interview them. They're all in school. They have to do it. But as soon as they graduate, good luck. You have to have good systems for keeping track of where people are and, their addresses and their phone numbers and getting them to participate. And that didn't happen. The response rates were very low to the Project Talent follow-up surveys. So NIH is still funding research on Project Talent to look at mortality studies and a few other things, but that wasn't a viable option. This red line, the National Educational Longitudinal Study of 1988, a study with 8th graders in 1988, followed them forward. They made the one mistake that I didn't think anybody would ever make in a cohort study, and that is at the fourth follow-up in 2000, they promised them, we will never contact you again, in writing. And so forget about that one. The other two here on the right, the Educational Longitudinal Study and the High School Longitudinal Study, note the names. They all have longitudinal, educational, they're all very repetitive names. In fact, there's a new cohort study out here. It's called High School and Beyond. They recycle the name from a previous cohort. Don't get me started. We can't follow these folks. They are too young. If we're going to do an aging study and we're going to seek money for primary data collection for aging research, these folks are too young, at least for now, maybe in a decade or two. That leaves us with two cohorts. High School and Beyond, which started with 10th and 12th graders in 1980, and NIS 72, which is a National Longitudinal Study of 1972, which started with high school seniors in 1972. And those are the cohorts that we went back to. We started with High School and Beyond for reasons I can't recall. I think it was because they were going to be age 50 when we wanted to recontact them, which is when HRS starts. And then recently we've got funding to follow up the NOS 72 cohort. EdSHARe, which many of you who work at ISRI may hear about. EdSHARe stands for Education Studies for Healthy Aging Research. You can argue about whether that's a good name, but it makes the acronym spell something. And it consists of these two cohort studies, NOS 72 and High School and Beyond. Originally, when we just had funding for High School and Beyond, we called it the High School and Beyond project, but then we got confused when we had funding for a second cohort. We couldn't keep calling it High School and Beyond, so we came up with another name. What I'm going to do today is talk about the most recent 2021-2022 follow-up of the High School and Beyond cohort that we just finished. What's in it? What's it for? And most importantly, how can you get involved? I'm here shamelessly evangelizing the research opportunities that are available with these data that are hot off the presses. I will talk about analyses that people are doing right now, some of them in the room, and we'll talk a little bit about the planned follow-up of the NLS 72 cohort that will start next year. So, High School and Beyond. High School and Beyond, as I said, started in 1980 with sophomores and seniors. There were almost 60,000. It's a national representative sample. It's a cluster sample. They randomly sample 1,000 schools, public, private, Catholic. And then within the schools, they randomly sample 10th and 12th graders. From 1982 to 1986, they were followed up every other year. Only a random subset of almost 27,000 were selected for the panel, but the random sampling overrepresented particularly interesting population groups. In this historical era, that included Cubans, but it also included high-achieving African Americans who went on to college or had, but also very probabilistically, so you can account for that in the weighting. So 27,000 people are in this panel, and this gives us really intensely rich contextual information about everything about their educations from high school through college, both from surveys, as I said, of them and teachers and school administrators, but also from transcripts and other administrative records. The sophomore cohort was followed up again in 1992. The thing about these NCES cohort studies is that they have astonishingly high response rates, not just in school when, you can sort of force kids to do it, not really, but you know what I mean, like they're a captive audience, but even once they're young adults and can choose freely not to participate, on the order of 80 to 90% response rates. These early waves of High School and Beyond were foundational for sociological and education and policy and other kinds of research on any number of topics. These are the ones I thought of right off the top of my head. Almost everything that we knew in the 80s and 90s about the racial achievement gap or gender and STEM fields or social capital or private schools or curriculum tracking all came from the High School and Beyond data back in the day. But then it's over. From the Department of Education's point of view, they're old now. We're done, right? That's where we came in, remember the beer, the idea. And we said what we should do is go back to the high school and beyond cohort. At that time, where it was 2011, 2012, we should go back to them once we get money. With funds from the Sloan Foundation and NSF and the Spencer Foundation, we cobbled together enough money to do a fairly basic follow-up. Then we did a short survey, it's about 20 minutes, and linkages to all kinds of administrative records. We were underfunded. We didn't have enough money to really incentivize participation. And there was a proof of concept. Can we find these people after all these years? And can we get them to participate? And we did, by and large, 62% participation rate. Almost everyone that we didn't, and that's of surviving people. We also linked the death record so we know who's not in the denominator. Almost everybody that we didn't interview, we were pretty sure we found them, so we know where they are. You know, people don't always cooperate, and as I said, we have very little money to offer them. We at some point we were offering $2 bills as an incentive, which is not in the survey research world anything. So we did that, and there were a number of publications that came from that, but it was really a proof of concept. We then went to NIH and said, hey, we did this. Wouldn't it be cool to have an HRS-like thing where you have all this rich early life data? And they said, okay, which was very surprising. So the high school and beyond cohort in 2021 was approaching age 60. I say 2021, it bled all the way over into most of 2022. It takes a while to interview 26,000 people. So they're about age 60. And the 2021 round was a little more involved. If you had participated, you'd have been asked to complete about a 40-minute survey that primarily covered cognition. Remember, it's NIA. I should say the Alzheimer's Association also contributed. So the NIA Alzheimer's disease branch and the Alzheimer's Association provided the funding. And so, not surprisingly, they're very interested in cognitive outcomes. So I'm going to talk in terms of cognition. But I say repeatedly, this is not just a study of cognition. We have all sorts of interesting physical and mental health outcomes, cognitive outcomes, behavioral outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes, and so forth. So surveys that primarily focused on cognition and health, but also a lot of other stuff. Also, a home health visit. We stopped calling it a "can we come to your house and collect blood" visit, and decided instead to call it a home health visit, which sounds much more innocuous. But really, we came to get blood and saliva, and to do a variety of measurements: blood pressure, pulse, height and weight, etc. And we linked like hell to administrative records, and we can go into what those are later. But essentially, anything that you can imagine, we've linked to. Not quite the same response rate, about 58%, even though we had considerably better incentives. Partly it's a COVID thing. No, you cannot come to my house in the height of the COVID pandemic, or no, I will not talk to you because I'm out of work because of COVID. I think COVID had a big impact. But I'd say these people are older, and response rates, it's not clear exactly why we got a somewhat lower response rate, but we did. So what is data good for? Let me try to answer that with a path diagram. If you're studying cognition and you're a medical researcher, I've spent the last couple of years going to Alzheimer's conferences, and so I kind of am like an anthropologist at those conferences, and I have a sense of how to approach things. This is a traditional biomedical approach to cognition, Alzheimer's disease, dementia. They know about educational gradients in dementia, and they know about racial gradients in dementia. But still, the focus of where to intervene to reduce rates of dementia, to reduce disparities in dementia, is right here, late adulthood. And really what that means is drugs. Intervene by finding a drug that will eliminate the symptoms of dementia. That's the biomedical approach. We don't come at it from that perspective. We come at it from more of a life course, social science, demographic, population health perspective. First of all, we don't think in terms of race being something that's just described at birth, and for whatever reason, rates differ of dementia, differ across racial groups. We think in terms of racism and opportunity structures and inequality and public policies and childhood conditions, all of which are racialized. We don't think in terms of educational attainment, which is literally the only thing that's ever measured in any research on Alzheimer's disease. How far did you go in school? The preposterous notion, according to this field, that two people who have the same degree may have had wildly different educational experiences, opportunities to learn, conditions of schooling, quality of schooling. That's novel, I think, in this field. So you think of education in terms of all the rich detail that we have from this cohort study. It's not enough to know just how far somebody went in school. You need to know what they learned, what they had an opportunity to learn, who they went to school with, how good their schools were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This opens up a possibility to intervene here. If we want to reduce rates of dementia for future generations and reduce disparities in dementia for future generations, we argue, potentially we can intervene there in terms of educational interventions, in terms of how opportunities are distributed early in life. It's a radical notion still in the Alzheimer's world, which is very much focused on where's the drug, right? And it's a little bit confusing to them. Like when you're talking about future generations, I'm talking about people who vote in the next presidential election. How can I get them a drug today, right? So this is a more forward-looking, early life intervention focus, this research. So this focus on education and opportunity structures and public policy doesn't get us out of thinking about the biology and thinking about how and why those early life things get under the skin and shape the biology that leads to Alzheimer's disease. So fundamentally, high school and beyond, and NNS 72, all of EdSHARe is focused on how education and racism and childhood circumstances influence the biological, but also the social processes across the whole life course that shape cognition later in life. And if you're not a cognition researcher, that's okay. The data are good for these things too. And I would write the same thing: mortality, physical health, mental health, well-being more generally, even economic outcomes, retirement, that kind of thing. That's what these data are good for, uniquely good for. And a sort of corollary of that is, can we modify the early life, especially educational environments and experiences and policies, to reduce the incidence of dementia later on and to reduce inequalities in dementia later on? And you can scratch out dementia and put any number of physical and mental health outcomes. All right, so that's the big picture. How are we measuring and studying these things? For this, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the design of the 2021 follow-up. Ideally, if you were a cohort member, you would complete a phone survey. And I say that because the best measures of cognitive functioning can be administered on the telephone. In person would have been better. We don't have that budget for high school and beyond. We do for NLS 72, but for high school and beyond, we wanted people to do a telephone survey where they'd experience a series of cognitive assessments and other content, everything else, updates on their health and jobs and families and other things. Then, if you were a sample member, you would consent to a home health visit where a company that mostly does life insurance visits, the people that come to your house to do your blood pressure and ask you questions if you're applying for life insurance, same company, they would come to your house using protocols that we developed and trained them to use to collect blood and saliva, to do a bunch of physical assessments, and to get some consents for things like pharmacy records, which almost everyone consented to. Among people who consented to a home health visit, a huge 90% said, sure, you can have all of my pharmacy records, which I found very surprising. However, you may not be surprised to know that not everybody is willing to do a telephone survey. People are hard to get a hold of. They don't want to be on the phone that long. And so we also offered an internet option, an internet mode. The problem is you can't do the same cognitive assessments on the web because they require trained interviewers, but also it's easy to cheat. If you're on the, if you're trying to do those assessments on the web, you could just cheat and it wouldn't be a valid test. So we developed a separate screener for cognitive impairment, mild forms of cognitive impairment. And the design was, is this person, are we really confident that this person is cognitively normal, cognitively fine? If they weren't, if we were a little bit in doubt, basically the bottom quarter of the distribution, we pushed them to do the phone anyway, even if they would have preferred to do the web. If they apparently cognitively fine from the web screener, they moved on and did the home health visit. However, to make sure that we were, from a methodological point of view, really sure that it's safe to assume that those people are cognitively fine, we assigned a random subset of those who did fine to also do the phone, so that we can test that assumption that people, these 75% of people who we never did the phone assessment on would have been fine. Don't worry about those details. That's the basic design. We then linked to administrative records like mortality records and consumer finance and pharmacy records and lots of others, building records, housing records, et cetera. That's the basic design. And finally, we have a small, couple of hundred people who wouldn't be either one of those modes. We did an emergency paper survey where at least we got basic information. And for a few people, a proxy survey. If people were too disabled or cognitively not able to participate, we did proxy surveys. So what can we do with all of this? Back to this basic diagram. All of the measures in red all come from the older surveys, 1980 through 1992 or 2015. Everything about education, everything about early life. A lot of the stuff about opportunity structures and public policies and racism requires spatial granularity. In 1980, we knew the precise address of the schools that the children went to. We don't know where they lived, but we know exactly where they went to school. Thanks to David, we now have the GIS coordinates of those schools, and we can map those to any kind of administrative boundaries. Is it a problem that we don't know where they lived, but we do know where they went to school? Sure, we'd rather know where they lived. But in that era, the vast majority of kids went to neighborhood schools. So it's not a terrible assumption to assume that they lived pretty close to that school. So all of the stuff in red comes from the earlier surveys. Genetic risk. Nobody is predestined to get Alzheimer's disease or not to get it, but there are genetic variants that put you at a higher risk for dementia. And so we need to account for that. And the way we do that is by collecting blood or saliva. You can get the same information from blood and saliva, the genetic variants that put you at risk. We collected 37 gallons of blood and 3 gallons of saliva. 37 gallons is about a bathtub full, to give you a sense. The first time I raised the idea of writing a supplement to collect blood and saliva, Kathy's first question was, exactly, yeah. So there's no any of these closets or anything. It's actually all at the Advanced Diagnostics Research Lab over on Washington Avenue, right across from the Bobby and Steve's. So if you want to visit it, that's where it is. So that took care of genetic risks. What about these biological processes through which early life influences shape later life outcomes? Here I want to talk about basically 4. First is biological markers of dementia risk. So the only way to really truly diagnose somebody with Alzheimer's disease is to take their brain apart and to do an autopsy. We can't do that for our cohort. They would not appreciate that. But it turns out that there are blood markers. This is a relatively new science, last 10 years. Really well-validated markers that you can see in the blood, proteins and other evidence from the blood that indicates that you're at elevated risk. And so I want to talk about those. Essentially, there are 4 kinds of blood markers that we collected. AD neuropathology are the plaques and tangles that you may hear about. Until recently, in order to assess whether you had those things in your brain, you either had to have an autopsy or a spinal tap, which also I'm guessing participants would not be interested in doing. But with very recent technology, you can see those things in blood. But that's very specific to the brain. Processes going on in your brain that indicate that even though you're cognitively fine now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you're probably in trouble. It's not clear whether it's causal, but it's at least correlational. So we know, geez, there's stuff in your brain that's bad. All these other processes are more whole body. There are a number of vascular and inflammatory and immunological processes that are correlated with cognition later on, but they're not specific to your brain. And they can all be measured with blood. We collected a lot of blood, as I said, even from each individual person. It was in tablespoons, but the vast majority of our blood is being stored for future assays that haven't been invented yet. By most study standards, we collected a lot of blood. if you're interested, the AB pathology measures are there. These are sort of the standard, the gold standard, what you would want to get about what's going on in people's brains. The first couple are measures of amyloid and tau. If you know anything about Alzheimer's disease, these are the hallmarks. But then a whole series of some tried and true, some more experimental measures of immunological and inflammatory and vascular pathways. Beyond that broad stuff, we got histories of major health problems, and then basic anthropomorphic stuff, height, weight, blood pressure, et cetera. This is former ISRD research scientist Nicole Schmidt, pretend interviewing her neighbor. Preparing for the field work, we prepared a YouTube video that we hoped would encourage people to participate by showing them what it looked like and really showing them that we would follow COVID protocols, because this was in late 2020. I can't remember that guy's name, but Nicole had a lot of fun doing this. So that's biological markers of dementia risk. The next thing I want to talk about is biological aging. You may know that even people who are the same chronological age, their bodies may age at different rates. It's sometimes called weathering. And weathering is known to be influenced by early life stressors and opportunities and other social and demographic types of things. This is rarely studied in population representative samples. It's very often the 36 people who wandered into my clinic. That's who I get data from. So we just recently got supplemental funding to construct all the most promising biological, there's a big methodological debate in this field about the best way to quantify your biological age. And so we're going to do all of them to test hypotheses about the role of biological, broader system-wide biological aging in shaping brain aging, which is sort of what dementia is. There's still debate in the field, by the way, about whether what's going on is that all that early life stuff shapes how fast your body ages, and then your brain just goes along with that. Or are they completely different processes? Can you have advanced brain aging, but not have advanced bodily aging, or vice versa? It's still quite an open field. And as I said, it's never really been done in a population representative sample of this size. There's work coming out of the HRS. I think Gina sent me a link today to a pretty high profile HRS biological aging paper. I think its sample size was 847. And that's HRS, which is, a big time study. So biological aging. The third biological pathway is the oral microbiome. The microbiome, of course, is all the creepy crawlies that live in your body. We're not measuring the gut microbiome because it would require us to get fecal samples, which we didn't feel like was plausible since this cohort had never been asked for any biological samples. Spit seemed more palatable, but it turns out there are really close connections between the oral and the gut microbiome. They're really one big system. The composition of the microbiome in your body or in your mouth is closely related to a series of health conditions, including Alzheimer's disease. This happens directly through channels whereby I'm a sociologist, remember, the bad germs can follow pathways directly into your brain, leading to problems, but more often the microorganisms, problematic microorganisms, can lead to inflammation and other bodily processes that then indirectly shape cognition later on. So all we need to study this is spit. And as I said, we got about 3 gallons of it. We were funded initially to collect the spit and store it. And it's, again, over on Washington Avenue, across from Bobby and Steve's. We have a proposal that will be reviewed at SSPA next week to do full genomic sequencing on all the microorganisms in your mouth. And that'll tell us what's in your mouth, what kinds of microorganisms, but also in what concentrations, the diversity of the microorganisms in your mouth, all of that matters, essentially. But again, the research on this, first of all, I reviewed, to write the proposal, the research on the effects of education and racism and early life stuff on the microbiome. And it was like 1 paragraph, and I had to stretch it because there wasn't any. And it was 12 people who came into my clinic, like that kind of a sample. So this is revolutionary stuff, I think, or potentially. This is really, I should say, Demmer's work in epidemiology. So we will find out soon if we can do that work. And the idea is that it's a mechanism through which early life shapes risk of cognitive problems later on. And the third one, for the time, given when we were in the field, was COVID. Thinking about COVID as a mechanism through which early life can shape later life cognition. There's a variety of theories, some with more evidence than others, about the ways in which COVID can shape cognition through stress processes, inflammatory processes, even things like loneliness and stress. All of these are hypothesized pathways through which COVID might influence cognition and risk of dementia later on, leading a lot of places, for example, Scientific American, to suggest that COVID may result in a tsunami of dementia in the years ahead. So we got a supplement and we asked questions about whether people have had COVID, whether they've been tested, vaccination histories, economic impacts that they might have experienced because of losing work, loneliness, science knowledge, which we can come back to, but that was very interesting. The idea was, do people just not know about science? And surely education and early life opportunities will shape who knows what about science later on. And what you know about science will impact how you respond to the pandemic. That's the hypothesis anyway. So besides the survey measures, of course, we got blood. And so we did testing of both whether people were vaccinated, we can tell, but separately whether they've been infected. The antibodies are different, so you can know both of those. So those are the biological pathways. How do we measure cognition? This again is not almost none of this is my area, but I'll tell you. So this was the design of the 2021 follow-up. And basically, we either learned about your cognition from the phone or from the web, depending on which mode you ended up with. On the phone, there are some web-related measures. These are primarily measures of memory and executive function. How well can you remember stuff, and how well does your brain process? So a delayed, immediate word recall list. I'm going to read you 10 words, and then I want you to tell me how many of those words. Tell me how many words you can remember out of those 10, just seconds later. A letter fluency task. I'm going to give you a letter. It's almost always F, and tell me all the words you can think of that start with F in the next minute. They feel like games, but these are pretty well validated psychometrically sound measures of in that case, executive function. Categories of fluency, in 1 minute, tell me how many animals you can think of. Backward digit span, I'm going to read you a number. I want you to read it back to me. And then later, I'm going to read you a number. I want you to read it back to me backwards. And the numbers are going to get longer and longer, and we see how long you can do that. And that's an executive processing task. And then those 10 words I told you about a while ago, how many of them can you remember now? A delayed recall task. I shouldn't out her, but in practicing, developing the instruments, only one person that I interviewed got 10 out of 10 on the delayed, and it was Lindsay. Gina probably did too, and now I'm in trouble. And then on every we ask about self-reported memory complaints. Lately, it's not lately, but some recent time period, have you had trouble remembering appointments? Have you had trouble learning how to use new gadgets? Have you had trouble remembering people's names? A series of self-reported memory issues. The web screener was trickier, and it was trickier because we knew that people would use desktops, they would use laptops, they would use tablets, they would use phones, they would have different browsers, they would have different connection speeds. And so we needed web instruments that would work across all of those. And these people are about 60. So if you have any 60-year-old relatives, you know about their technological stuff, right? So we needed it to work for everybody. And we went down to 2 assessments that have been pretty well validated by a woman at Harvard who's a psychometrician. One is a visual paired associates task. I'm going to give you 25 pairs of words. For example, officer and kettle. And then after a while, I'm going to come back and say, all right, which word went with officer? That's easy now because you just had 1. It's kettle. But if you had 25 of these, it's more difficult. And it's really just a matter of how many you get out of 25 and also how quickly you get them. And the visual paired associates task, which works very much the same, but it's pictures. Here's 2 barns. Here's another pair of buildings. And I do that for 25 pairs. And then I come back later and say, hey, which picture went with that picture? And you may already be having trouble after 1. It's that one. But again, it feels like a game, but it's a well-validated measure, in this case, of memory and executive function. And you ask this on self-reported memory complaints items. So that's, in a nutshell, how we measure cognition. But remember, this could also be, if you're not into cognition or dementia or Alzheimer's research, this is an amazing study. We've updated the National Death Index through late 2022. There's about 1,500 deceased sample members. This was the AIDS cohort, by the way. This is the cohort that was at exactly the wrong ages at exactly the wrong time for AIDS. And now there are also older people during COVID, but you have plenty of car crisis, tragic, the car crashes and suicides and homicides, and now heart disease and cancer. This is a really interesting mortality cohort. It's also an interesting cancer cohort. We're one of the first studies to be in the pilot program to link to individual state tumor registries. And that work's in progress. We're not funded yet, but we've linked to several states. And of course, from the mortality records, we know who died of cancer, and we have cancer histories from the last 2 surveys. So among survivors, have you ever been diagnosed with cancer? What kind of cancer, in what years? Are you in remission? Have you done various kinds of screening, et cetera? So this would be an amazing cancer cohort, or a cardiovascular disease cohort, or a mental health cohort, et cetera. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the research that's in progress. And again, I'm evangelizing here. So I'm not telling you these to say, we've thought of all the research ideas, hands off. This is, here's what we've started on. You may have other ideas. This is to give you a flavor of what we're working on. So the core questions, how, why, and for whom does education impact cognition later in life? The PI team with assistance from various research assistants is working on that. Likewise, do racial inequities in education earlier in life translate into racial inequities in cognition decades later, where the team is working on that. Likewise, does education provide resilience to biological risks? You may have all the biological risks that we know of for experiencing Alzheimer's disease, all the plaques and tangles, all the immunological or cardiovascular problems, but you're still not guaranteed to get Alzheimer's disease. Why do some people who have all of the biological risks remain cognitively normal so long? And why do some people who have none of those biological risks experience Alzheimer's disease? This is a matter of trying to understand whether education and other early life things provide resilience to biological risks. So we're looking on that. More specifically, some other projects that we're working on, just to give you a flavor of what's possible. Does exposure to lead in childhood impact later life cognition? And do these effects vary depending on your socioeconomic resources or your education or your how you're racialized? Doing this work, proposal that's due soon with Jennifer Webb at Boston University. Rafa and Hiron, I think Rafa's here, Hiron maybe not, are looking at how residential and school segregation, how segregated where you live was and the school that you went to was, how that may get under the skin and impact health and cognition decades later, primarily through stress processes, but possibly through other processes. Jesse Himmelstern, I should say, I'm indicating which ones of these are going to be on the PAA program. So if you would like to hear more, that paper will be at the PAA, as will Jesse's paper on whether you often hear about people like you need to have games and puzzles and cognitively demanding jobs to stave off dementia. Is there any truth to that? Does having an occupation that's more cognitively demanding actually help you? Is that a mediator linking education to later life cognition? So Jesse's tackling that. Hiron Jung, who I think is here, is doing work on how intergenerational mobility, like in a classic sociological sense, intergenerational socioeconomic, doing better or worse than your parents, does that have consequences for later life health and cognition, and how might racism moderate those relationships? As I said, Jesse, but also Ryan Denner are doing work on the microbiome. Until we have the microorganisms sequenced, a really good proxy that most studies use is whether people have had periodontal disease. If you've had periodontal disease, you, by definition, have problematic microorganisms in your mouth. The main determinants of periodontal disease are access to dental care and what you eat. And those things you can imagine are highly stratified by education and race, where you grew up and socioeconomic circumstances. So it's not crazy to think that periodontal disease, but also the microbiome, may mediate the relationship between early life stuff and later life health. Does the quality of this is fundamental? Does the quality of the secondary schools that you go to shape later life outcomes? Hiron is working on a really innovative way of measuring the quality of people's schools. Does exposure to crime when you're a kid impact later life mental, physical, and cognitive health? Bria Gresham, who's a top studies trainee, is working on that. What role does knowing about science play in stratifying people's willingness to be vaccinated for COVID-19? And how is science knowledge shaped by early life experiences? Isabella State, who's a project staff member, is working on that. Amanda Thomas, who's a top health trainee, is looking at how surviving cancer impacts socioeconomic outcomes down the road. So that's the high school and beyond cohort. That's what we're doing there. What about the second cohort, NLS 72, the National Longitudinal Study of the high school class of 1972? The basic design is similar. They were first interviewed in 1972 as seniors. They were interviewed every year for a couple of years, and then every other year, and then on and off through 1986. And then the Department of Education is done with them because by 1986, they're 14 years out of high school. The Department of Education doesn't care about them anymore. But we have funding to go back to them. As soon as I'm done here, I'm required to go continue to work on the questionnaire. We have time for a 3-hour visit to people's homes. About 40 minutes or 50 minutes of that will be surveys. About an hour will be cognitive assessments, but we will also do home health visits where, again, we draw blood and saliva and the like. It's a smaller cohort, about 14,500 people. Again, nationally representative, same cluster design, same overrepresentation of some interesting population groups. And innovation, there's two innovations really relative to high school and beyond. One is that these are in-person assessments, so we can do more sophisticated cognitive tests. Another is this MRI subsample. For about 500 people living in one of 5 cities, they will be invited to go do brain scans. As I said, picking people's brains apart is the best way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, but through MRI scans, you can see problems, even if people aren't symptomatic yet. And so the goal is to get 500 people stratified by education and race and how they're doing cognitively when we go interview them into MRIs. And of course, we'll link to a bunch of administrative records as we did with the high school and beyond cohort. And fundamentally, it's the same question. How do education, racism, childhood circumstances get under the skin, shape your biology and shape your social and economic outcomes in a way that impacts cognition and feeling other health outcomes later on? And can we modify early life to improve later life outcomes and reduce inequalities in later life outcomes? So that's what we're up to. I would be remiss if I didn't thank our funders. So I'm happy to take any manner of question about any of this. That one here, Stacy, do I just call on people? Or Lindsay? Okay.
No, not me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
I was just wondering about, you're calling old people and asking a lot of personal information. And I was wondering how you get over the warrant. I've told my grandmother, don't answer these kinds of questions.
Sure. Yeah. That's a legitimate question, and it's especially in this day and age, right? So we rely on a couple things. One is brand loyalty, like counting on a fair number of people knowing that, okay, these people have been calling me since I was in high school. Nothing bad has ever happened. This isn't some stranger. So that's one thing. The other is, well, we have to follow all the human subjects and IRB requirement. We have to do informed consent, but to do it in a way that is the least scary and the least, I call it like if the consent form looks like you're reading a cell phone contract, we failed, right? Because that's scary and it's like I can't make sense of all of that. I don't trust you. To do it in a way that's as humane as possible and to train interviews and field staff to answer questions in like a human way and not a technical way. We also, this might not really answer the question. Incentives matter, and not like a bribe, but as a, hey, we know it's a lot for you to take an hour of your time. So we want to offer you X dollars as compensation for that. That's another way. We've had these huge layoffs since we last interviewed people. So that's a burden. But if we're doing it right from now on, we stay in touch. You know, we send periodic newsletters. Here's the kinds of things that we're learning from the data that you so nicely provided. Here's a birthday card. Hey, thank you for participating. Happy birthday. Oh, and by the way, if you want to update your address, follow this QR code, right? Also, a participant-friendly website. So we're now developing the researcher website for the project, but also a participant website where they can learn about like who the hell's paying for this and who are these people and what are they doing with my data. That's the strategy. It won't work for everybody, but it might work. I'm counting on Stacy to tell me when the internet has questions, but Anne had her hand up.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Rob. This is super interesting. I'm wondering about the diagnostics you do, like the AD, RD, neuropathology results and those sorts of things, about whether you make those available to your subjects and what the effect of that intervention of telling is, both ethically and for follow-up future.
Yeah. We do feel an obligation to tell them about problematic test results. If they have uber high blood pressure, we have a whole protocol. You need to go see a doctor, and here's why, and here's what to tell them, and a few other things like that. The problem with these ADRD biological risk things is that they are correlated, but there is huge scientific debate. If your brain has got all kinds of amyloid and tau tangles, you're more likely to get Alzheimer's disease. But the vast majority of people who have those things don't develop Alzheimer's disease. And it's actually a huge, like there's a push now. There's I think they're moving towards at-home tests. So you can see, do I have an elevated risk? But most people who test positive will never develop the disease. And so it's not clear what the ethics of that is, right? Most people are going to be harmed by coming up with a false positive. They're going to live their lives differently, thinking, oh shit, I'm going to have Alzheimer's disease in X number of years. I better, do X, Y, and Z in my life, when in fact they're not going to. So we don't report back the neuropsychological results, at least not yet. Maybe by the time we're in the field with NLS 72, there'll be different thinking or different diagnostic precision of these kinds of things. But it's really an open question about whether those things are things that happen in your brain and then you have a symptom, or they're just things that happen in your brain and also maybe later you'll have symptoms, but they're not causal. So, it's tricky.
It could also be a deterrent because some people might not want to know.
It's true.
I know my mother-in-law wouldn't want to know.
Yeah.
My question was, number one, I have a couple questions. Number one, did you have gender differences in the phone response rates? Because we're seeing that in a city I'm collecting data on, and they're telling me that women are less likely to respond to phone calls, which I thought was interesting. When you go to the people's houses, are you rating the home?
Mhm.
Like, are you having them do some kind of rating of their house?
Time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Men don't respond to surveys.
Men don't respond to your survey, even the phone ones.
Yeah.
Are you telling them that you're calling?
Sorry?
Are you telling them ahead of time that you're calling?
Yeah, they always get a mail ahead of time.
Yeah, I was wondering.
We'll tell them like what time, but
Yeah.
Hey, we're in the field, here's $5, and they'll, just as a warning, I guess. What was the second question?
The second question was whether you're rating the home.
No, so for high school and beyond, the only people that went to the home were this phlebotomy company. But for NLS 72, yes, we're already thinking about what would we have the interviewer record.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that home questionnaire. I don't know if they have a version of it for older adults, but I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, so HRS and other surveys have done this, and we're
Oh, cool.
we're mostly focused on what to ask the people, but that's certainly coming.
Interesting too, to have like an interviewer rating of like Ad Health did of the person's race or something. I don't know. There's some interesting data that came out of that.
For sure, that's
Since you're going to be in their house.
the plans, and also photograph their medicine cabinet.
Oh, that's good.
Consent,
Yeah.
we take a picture of all your pill bottles.
My last question was, how do you get the data?
It's a great question. Thank you. It's almost as though I planted that question. I didn't. The Department of Education has always been funny about their survey data. On the one hand, early back in the day, there were these public use files that had people's exact birth dates and the names of their schools. But now they realize that's not so good. And so the data are only available through the survey data are only available with a restricted data license from the Department of Education. We have 2 of them here. They're hard to get, but they require that you analyze the data in a locked, non-networked room. That's the survey data. They've never dealt with biological data. The biological data and the genomic data will be released through separate vendors. The Alzheimer's Association has a repository, and has a repository. So as a user, you're going to have to get a restricted data license from NCES. And then you're going to have to go through those repositories and bring the data into the NCES. That's a pain. All of this is a pain in the ass. This is why we applied for a PO1. The PO1's purpose was make it easy for people. Give us staff to walk them through it, to write templates for what they should say, to help them set up their labs, to bring them in here and have them, you know, it didn't work, but we're still working on that is the mission of the next 2 years, is make it easy for people to do data discovery, to get access to these linked data without violating the law. Stacy.
We have a question online from Bert. Bert asks, did you have to use informants for cognitive assessments for any of the participants? And if so, do you know the percent roughly?
It was a very small percentage. So the question is about proxy interviews. How often were people not able to participate themselves? And so a family member or someone did it for them. It was a single-digit number for high school. Beyond that was 60. It's pretty uncommon to have serious cognitive problems. And a few people I think that did it had serious other health problems. You know, for some reason they're bedridden or, you know, but it was very small. For NL72, it'll be larger. We know from the HRS and other surveys that the percent who need proxy interviews goes up, you know, as people age. So we're gearing up for that. And we're also actually gearing up for, it's great that you can participate today, but in the future, should you not be able to participate, is there somebody that you would nominate now to be your proxy in the future? We've learned from other studies that that's a really important thing to do.
And this will be the last question.
Thank you. This is a really fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether or not you're collecting family histories of neurological illnesses, because my sense is that it's not usually an isolated person getting it.
Right.
So would that be collected, and how does that add to the study if it is?
We didn't in high school and beyond, and that was a casualty of survey length. In NL72, we're literally still debating. Like I said, I have to go back right after this and go work on the survey, and that's one that's on the chopping block. Should we ask? Should we not? The reason is that the neuropsychologists tell us that it's not very heritable. That they're, you know, whether your parents died of dementia may or may not tell you much about the person's own risk of dementia. Much more important is things like how old were your parents when they died, and what was their health later in life. So we're definitely asking about that kind of thing, but I'll take this as one vote to ask the cause of death. Or maybe even just, did they experience dementia? Yeah, right. Yeah. You know, the sociologist in me automatically says, you got to get an occupation history and you got to get a family history. And we're not going to have a family history. We know that people are married. We know a little bit about how many kids they have. Certainly from back in '86 with NL72, they got all kinds of details about that. But we're going to have for sociologists, shockingly little about people's families in the interim. It's a weakness.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Thank you, Rob. And thanks to everybody else.
Thank you all.